Hi, this is Mike Fauché, and now that you've installed the Hyper-V add-on into Windows 8, it's now time to configure Hyper-V and create our first virtual machine. So the first thing I actually like to do is to make sure that I have some basic settings done so it facilitates creating my first virtual machine. And the very first setting that I like to change is the actual Hyper-V settings themselves. Now this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it sets the defaults for all subsequent virtual machines. And it determines basically the location of where you want to store your virtual disks and as well as your virtual machine settings. So I'm going to actually repoint this to an SSD here, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it just for this experiment, and I'm going to click folder select, and that sets my default location. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit apply, and then I'm going to do the same thing over here for the virtual machine settings. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to the same thing, and I'm going to create another folder, and I'm going to call it, I'll just call it VMs. Make it simple. I'm going to hit select folder, and that's going to set that default location. The rest of the stuff I'm going to go ahead and leave alone. So then I'm going to click OK and save all those settings. The next thing I'm going to need to do before I create my first virtual machine is to select this virtual switch manager, and this basically creates a virtual NIC card. So I'm going to go ahead and hit new. I'm going to say create an external switch, and the reason it's an external is because I want it to go out to the internet. It's not isolated to my local network. So I'm going to create virtual switch. I'm going to give it a name. I'm just going to call it test switch for now. And here's where it's actually picking the NIC card that I actually have, and I'm going to leave the box that says allow management. That allows me to actually remote in and make changes. So basically that's all I need to do. I'm going to hit apply. It's going to tell me it's going to temporarily disconnect, and I am now ready to create my first virtual machine. So with that in mind, let's get started with that. So I'm going to right click on, oops, wrong one. I'm going to right click on new, or just left click on new, click on virtual machine, and it's going to walk me through a wizard. So I'm going to go ahead and say next. And this is where I get to actually name my first machine. So I'm going to go ahead and call it test. And this is where I have the option down here where it says stored to a different location. I'm going to leave it where since I've changed my defaults, I'm going to leave it exactly where it is. No need to change it at this point, but you can if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And here's an option for creating generation 1 or generation 2 VMs. For the most part, 90% of the time, you're going to go ahead and stick with generation 1. But there are certain situations if you're trying to replicate, or if you're going to run a 64-bit environment, such as Server 2012, where you might want to use Generation 2. Now, bear in mind, Generation 1 will also work with all 64-bit machines. You just don't get the EFI type BIOS boot configurations that you get in Generation 2. So we'll skip that for now and just leave the default of Generation 1. So I'm going to hit next. And this is where I'm going to tell it how much memory to use. And typically you're going to use whatever basically you're going to start with whatever your OS requires and then work your way up from there. So typically for a Windows, I'm going to create a Windows 7 professional machine. So for that, I typically go at least 3 gigs. So I'm going to go ahead. And again, this depends on what you're trying to do. If you if your minimum storage, minimum memory requirements are 512, you can leave it at 512 and check the use dynamic memory, which will expand and allocate more memory as needed. I typically don't do that, but again, it depends how much physical RAM you have to allocate. The less physical RAM you have, the more you're going to want to go a little bit conservative on this. So I've got a little bit to work with, so I'm going to leave it at 3,000 or 3 gigs. Hit next, and this is where that test switch I created, this is where I get to assign it to this virtual machine. So, and again, you can use a whole bunch of virtual machines against the same test switch. You don't have to, or a VM switch. You don't actually have to create one for each virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and select that one. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. This is where it's kind of defaulted to the same. This is where it's creating the virtual hard drive itself, and it's picked up the name of the VM machine that I called it test. And again, I'm going to leave all of that. The only thing I'm going to change is the default is 127 gigs for the hard drive. I really only need about 20 or 30 for Windows 7 Professional. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 30. I'm going to create it for 30. And I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And this is sort of important because this is where you're going to actually pull the ISO file from. So I'm going to say I want to install an operating system, and here's where I have a choice of using either a physical drive, so I can actually install from a physical DVD, or I can pick an ISO file. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the ISO file because it's a whole lot faster. And I made a directory earlier that I'm calling ISO, and I'm going to pick the Windows 7 Ultimate from that. Click open, and now it's going to assign that ISO file to that. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. Here's a summary of everything I'm about to create. I'm going to go ahead and hit finished. It's going to go ahead and create my test machine. So you can now see it listed up here. The one thing I want to do before I actually get started is I might want to make a couple more changes. So let's take a look at settings on here. I'm going to right click, hit settings. And here's a few things that I can actually change. You can see everything on the left that can be altered for each particular virtual machine. Most of the stuff here is not all that important, other than when after the machine is created, you can change the order, because by default it's going to pick from the ISO file. It's going to go ahead and check that, and it's kind of much like booting a real machine where you set the DVD as your primary boot device. So you may want to change this to a hard drive later. It's just like a regular BIOS. This is the memory that you've set up, which you can change at any time. And this is the one that I usually change. So this is how many processors you're allocating to it. So I'm going to go ahead and allocate 4 virtual processors for it. And again, this is totally up to you, and it depends on the type of, how much you're going to use the machine, what you expect it to do. I typically do some transcoding from some of the VMs that I use, so I typically allocate more processors, but again, you don't have to. And again, this is the virtual IDE controller for both the hard drive as well as the DVD drive, which is actually again an ISO file. Here you have your network switch, and then you have a bunch of other settings you can change, which you don't really need to at this point. The one other thing that may be important later is you can actually add hardware. So if you want to add more virtual drives, you can. You can add you can add a SCSI controller and add multiple hard disks to it at a later time. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and leave that. So that machine's been created. It's now in the off state. So what I'm going to do now is we have a couple of choices. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on it, and I'm going to hit start. Now the minute I do that, what you're going to see is the machine starting down here. And if I go ahead and double click on this machine, and let me bring that into the picture here, you're going to see the normal Windows 7 installation exactly as you would on a physical machine. So once you do that, you basically walk through the installation until you're all the way through, and then you've installed your virtual machine. Once it's completed with the install, you don't actually have to always access it from the Hyper-V Manager. You can just do a straight remote desktop from any PC into your virtual machine and run it just like you would any other remote session. And that concludes the video. Hope you found it useful, and good luck creating your virtual machines.